New York State's highest court tosses out a lawsuit led by Congresswoman Elise Stefanik over early mail voting. Today, the state's Court of Appeals rejected a challenge to a voting expansion law that was approved last year by state lawmakers. That law allowed any registered voter to vote by mail. The 6-1 ruling affirms a lower court's decision, finding that the voting expansion does not violate the state constitution. The challenge was led by Elise Stefanik. In a statement, the Congresswoman says that she calls New York's court system corrupt and disgraceful, and said the ruling essentially declares that for more than 150 years, New York elected officials, voters, and judges misunderstood their own state's constitution. Now,